Let's talk about how to name your podcast for instant success. The thing is, if you are going to start a podcast, having the right name is really important, right? So let's have an overview about this conversation here. So the thing is that the name of your podcast is an important part of your brand because it makes a sort of strong first impression on new listeners. This is important because if you have new listeners and who actually come across your podcast, your name will automatically convey to them the kind of nature in, the kind of personality you have, and the kind of angle through which you cover the topics that you are covering. So names makes that your name will make a strong first impression on new listeners. And the name is also important because it makes your podcast easier to find in directories. Remember, your podcast is not really isolated in this ecosystem. Your podcast will be on directories as diverse as Apple Podcast, Spotify Podcast, Google Podcast, and so on and so forth, iTunes, iHeartRadio, and so on and so forth. So if you want your listeners to find, your prospective listeners to find, or even your existing listeners to find your podcast, you want to have the right name. And also, your name is important because it boosts your SEOs in relevant Google searches and also Bing searches. Remember, when we talk about names, a name is not just how you actually choose to identify your podcast. The name can also be a set of tags, can be a set of keywords, can be a set of important keywords that will help differentiate your podcast from others, but also help search algorithms direct the right traffic to your podcast. And your podcast name is also important because it sets the tone for your brand, right? So basically, you're trying to convey to your audience what kind of podcast you are. And depending on the name that you have, you also are communicating your personality, your vision, your podcast goals to your audience. And the name that you choose has to be in sync with your audience. And your podcast brand name is also important because it helps you reach your target audience. Okay. And so what I want to talk about, so when we have a conversation about naming your podcast, remember that you need to have all those 5 elements in mind. By the way, boss, welcome back to the show. It's really a wonderful pleasure to have you here. Make yourself comfortable. We are going to have a great conversation about how to name your podcast. Now, let me give you a decision here. So when we talk about naming your podcast, you have 3 types of podcast names. And this is important across the board that you'll find the right podcast name for your audience. And so you can have creative, and so we have creative and abstract podcast titles. So creative podcast names can create intrigue and make your content stand out from the crowd while not fully explaining what the podcast is all about. It's like you creating some kind of what we call intelligent confusion. And so the creative and abstract podcast titles are a great option for podcasters who are not relying on search to bring in new podcast listeners. Okay, this is important. So this is for creative and abstract podcast titles. So for example, you have names such as 20,000 Hertz, 99% Invisible, and All Consuming. Like when you hear those names, you have no idea what the podcasts are about, right? And again, they don't care about search engines anyway to bring them new listeners because they care about their own community and they care about what we will call word of mouth. So that's number 1. You also have descriptive podcast titles. So the specificity of descriptive titles conveys the podcast topic and draws in new listeners. So think of the descriptive podcast titles as the opposite of creative and abstract podcast titles. And so this descriptive podcast titles are great for independent podcasters building their audience because they quickly convey their subject. So let me give you a few examples here. You have Stuff You Should Know Podcast, I Will Teach You How to Be Rich, and Financial Feminist. So right off the bat, you have a clear idea what this podcast is about, right? And a podcast can also be named after the host. You can use your name in your podcast title if you are a well-known creator with an established following. So avoid using your name unless you already have an existing audience. So for example, you have The Ramsey Show, you have Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend, and The Tim Ferriss Show. So choosing a podcast name category is an excellent place to start. So this is really fantastic. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We're having a conversation about how to name your podcast. Let me give you a few pro tips here. I want to give you 10 tips for creating the perfect podcast name. The first thing you want to do is you want to convey your message and tone. So make sure your podcast titles indicate the topic of your content. So you want to start by answering these questions. What is your message, topic, tone, and theme? What is your niche? What is your vision for your podcast? This is really important. The second thing you want to do here is you want to survey the competition. So you want to search podcasts within your genre to get ideas for your podcast name. So how can your podcast title stand out from others in its category? See, the whole thing is, it's not about copying what's already happening in the industry. It's not about either. It's neither about reinventing the wheel, right? So you want to differentiate yourself in a good way, but without being too much differentiated. Think about that. So the cool thing is you have to be original. So just seeing other podcast titles can get your gears running. And it's also important to understand that at the end of the day, the name that you choose has to be in sync with you, has to resonate with you. It has to reflect your personality, because behind every podcast is a voice, and behind every voice is a person. And you are the person with whom the name that you choose has to resonate. And the third thing I want you to do here is I want you to keep it specific and succinct. So a lot of great podcast names are short, catchy, and less than 4 words or 15 to 20 characters. And Apple Podcasts does not have a field for a podcast subtitle or tagline, but you can think of your description as a place to include more details and keywords. Okay, let me give you a few examples here. We have a 9 to 5ish, Backpacker Radio. We have Story Corps. So those names are very short. So, and it's really good also if you have to submit your podcast later on to podcast directories, because you don't want to have like a kilometric name. No, you want to have things as short as possible. So the bottom line here is what? Bottom line is trying to convey your message and tone within the name. You want to survey the competition to see what they're doing, not copy them, but trying to get inspiration from them. And you want to also keep it specific and brief. The next thing you want to do here is try to use keywords to boost searchability. Now, especially if you are a new podcaster, it's important to actually draw new listeners into your podcast by having keywords that really describe pretty clearly what you are about, what your podcast is about. So using keywords in your title can help potential listeners find your content in directories such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and boost search engine rankings. It's really good. And avoid keywords. You want to avoid keyword stuffing though, because this can detract from your podcast name. And one thing I want to say also is that it's really important to remember that Apple Podcast might reject a subtitle with too many keywords. If you're not really sure whether your subtitle violates this rule, you want to review Apple Podcast guidelines. And another thing I want you to pay attention to here is to check for podcasts with the same name. See, the whole thing here is that when you are anytime you're doing something creative, you want to avoid internet, and you want to avoid IP infringement lawsuits, like intellectual property infringement, right? So it's really important for you to check domain availability. You can secure the domain name if it's available. Think about social media handles. So Instagram, Facebook. So Facebook being Meta now. You have Twitter being X now. Think about, you want to check Google. And you want to check also podcast directories. I mean, actually, as a matter of fact, this is where you should really start your search. You want to start your search in podcast directories. Go on Apple Podcast and Google Podcasts or Spotify Podcast and see if the name is already there. If it is, then switch to another name, right? Again, the goal here is, if you're trying to name your podcast, you want to differentiate yourself, but most importantly, you don't want your listeners to be confused. You don't want your prospective listeners you don't want your prospective listeners to confuse your podcast with an existing podcast. They'll be like really, really, really crazy. So be very careful there. And one thing I want to say also is that when I talk about making your using keywords to boost searchability, just make sure that it's only great when you start. when you have an established audience, you don't need to actually boost searchability anymore, because that existing audience will help you grow further and further and further. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We're having a conversation about how to name your podcast. One thing I want you to do here is that if you're trying to find the perfect name, use the podcast name generator. And the thing is that, people say, well, I don't need a name generator to actually name my podcast. Well, you might need a name generator. There are businesses that use name generators to find business names. If you have a startup, you might use a name generator to actually find a name. So why not do the same thing for a podcast? It's totally possible. Now, podcast name generators can help you brainstorm creative podcast name ideas. And it's not about choosing the name directly from the name generator. It's about a tool that helps you, that gives you inspiration and helps you think about certain names. And so there are several platforms to actually use if you want to generate names automatically for your podcast. For example, you have Shopify's name generator. You have Namelix. You have BizName, Wix. You have Mighty Networks niche generator. You have Portland podcast name generator. You have Squad Help. So the bottom line here is what? You want to start your search through those name generators, and you can refine whatever name they give you. You can refine it to actually suit your audience, right? So think of the name generator as a good start, but then you have to do some of the work yourself. Unless the name generator gives you a name that you really love, which is not always the case. But if it does, then you're good to go. If not, you might have to refine stuff yourself. And the next thing I want you to do here is the name that you choose, make it easy to say and spell. And I'm not talking about saying and spelling only in English. I'm saying making it easy to say and spell in multiple languages, because the whole thing is that your podcast might be small now and you might start in the US, but chances are at some point you might have to your audience might comprise listeners from all over the world. Obviously they have to speak English, but the bottom line is if they can't pronounce your podcast, if the name is already complicated, this makes things a little difficult. So keeping your podcast title easy to spell and pronounce makes it more likely people will find you in relevant searches. This is really good. I want to give you a few examples here. You have Making Space, Checkening, Human Hope. So those are great names, and those are positive names, by the way. When we talk about having a name that's easy to say and spell, make the name positive as well. Nothing negative in your podcast title. You want to make your podcast name memorable. This is so important. So when we talk about having a good podcast name, you have to understand a good title is catchy and easy to remember. The easier it is to remember, the more likely listeners will recommend it to someone else. And you can actually run a poll on social media or poll your friends in a group text to test out different options. And again, we're trying to really keep things simple. We're trying to keep things memorable, easier to remember. It's important to understand that this is how you build an audience. This is how you build a community, right? Because folks will actually recommend your podcast to their friends and so on and so forth. Now, social media at some point will actually step in to bring in more listeners. But at the beginning, this is how you actually grow your audience. And number 9, you want to keep it similar to your business name or brand name. So using the same name as your business or brand makes it easier for people to look you up in directories and apps. So not all brands follow this rule, but it's a great idea if you want to make sure people find your content, especially if you are a beginner. If you're a beginner, you want to have consistency. That's what we call brand consistency. And this is also great for you in terms of your content strategy. And then the final rule that I want you to really stick to is leave room to grow. So podcasts change over time, and a good podcast name allows for that. So you want to choose a dynamic show title that is descriptive with a degree of flexibility. So again, when we talk about branding, we're talking about flexibility. We're talking about the ability to adapt to changing trends, the ability to adapt to new trends, or let's say let's say tomorrow you just decided to revamp the vision of your podcast. Not totally, but at least 50% or 30%. Then you want to give yourself the ability to change also the name or the title for that matter. And it shouldn't be that complicated. Because the bottom line here is you still want to connect with the audience. You still want to be able to, you want your name or the title, the podcast title, to reflect your personality, but also reflect the new vision you have for the podcast. So the bottom line is you want to have that flexibility. And again, we're speaking about flexibility, but we are also talking about differentiation, right? Because you want to differentiate yourself in the marketplace. You want to, when people go on, podcast directories, you want your title to be there, but your title to be unique among the gazillions of names that are out there as well. Let me give you a bonus here. If you're still here after 15 minutes, I want to reward you with a few extra tips. There are things that you need to avoid in your podcast name. First of all, you want to avoid expletives and offensive language. Apple Podcasts automatically rejects titles with certain offensive language, so this is important. And if you are the same thing goes with Spotify. Now, Spotify is more flexible, but they also might have some strict rules. And you can review Apple Podcast content guidelines for a complete list of things to avoid. And using the word podcast. So most listeners will know that your show is a podcast from its context. So maybe they found it in a podcast app or saw it recommended as a great new podcast. So adding the word podcast to your title takes up valuable space that could be used to communicate what the show is about. So avoid using the word podcast in your title unless your show falls into one of these exceptions. When you already use the same name in another medium, when podcasting is the subject of your podcast. So you need to understand if your podcast is about podcasting, feel free to include the word podcast in your title. This will help clarify what your podcast is about. Okay. And, so this is really great. And one thing I also need to say is that don't use special characters, misspellings, abbreviations, and punctuation. Like intentional misspellings or odd abbreviations make it hard for new listeners to find you. And you don't want to waste time because you have a few seconds to convince new listeners or prospective listeners to actually sign on to your podcast. So don't waste valuable real estate. Don't waste valuable impressions. You want to go straight to the point. And adding your name to the end of your title. So Apple Podcast now rejects titles with the creator's name at the end. So for example, like the Smart Dog Podcast with Jane Doe. So if you want to include your name in your podcast, use this format: the Joe Rogan Show, the Tim Ferriss Podcast. So you want to put your name at the beginning of the title, not at the end. Okay. So it's important to really keep that in mind. But the bottom line here is what? The bottom line is you need to also, you need to study more the rules, like the rules that are available or the rules that are in effect on the platform or on the directory where you want to upload your podcast. And those rules change all the time. So it's always important to review the latest rules before you actually name your podcast. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. In today's conversation, I just spoke to you about how to name your podcast, and I give you the overview. I give you the decision, and I give you a few pro tips, and I give you a bonus at the end. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. God bless you. I'll see you next time. But until then, remember, stay